Today, we become legends.
Freya, the god who's been through 3 different reworks and was completely unbalanced in every single one. This god will never be balanced, cursed to ping pong between completely broken and utterly useless depending on the meta and how generous the balance team is feeling at any given moment. If you're looking to cop some cheap gems, you can grab them on sale over at my Nexus creator link and support the channel. That's nexus.gg/intersect3. Freya is probably one of, if not the most volatile design Smite has to offer, and the core of why she will never be balanced lies mostly in 2 abilities, Pulse and Irradiate. These 2 abilities are Freya. The rest of what she has is just ancillary to support these 2 steroids. And just those words are already a problem. 2 steroids. Arachne suffers from a similar syndrome but to a much lesser extent, as she also has 2 steroids in her base kit. It usually makes for a very frustrating and item reliant design. Freya though is even more reliant on her 2 steroids than Arachne is, to the point where she is completely irrelevant without them. She goes from a melee carry who is too frail and low mobility to get in and do anything, to God on Earth with ranged basic attacks that slow and do 1/5 of your health per hit. It's this duality that makes Freya not only polarizing in her gameplay, but also in her balance. The main problem with this is that Freya is the most item reliant god in an already heavily item reliant role. Freya's balance therefore relies almost entirely on how good her item pool is. Given most of her item pool is pretty much exclusive to magical ADCs, this makes for a very hard to balance god. If rings and other magical ADC items are strong, Freya is on top of the meta. If they're not, she will languish in bottom tier. You would think this would apply to the other magical ADCs in the same way, and it does to a certain extent. These gods somewhat live and die together, but Sol, Kronos and Oleron have other qualities that make them useful. Sol gets a ton of free stats from her passive, making rings less necessary for her. Kronos also gets some free stats as well as decent CC and an ult that can reset his entire health bar and cooldowns. Oleron has one of the best utility ultimates in the entire game. Freya doesn't really have anything but pressing 2 then 1. Her banish is purely there to set up her pulse irradiate basics, and the ult is purely there to secure kills if your 2-on-1 wear off. These both can also be used as self peel, but they're really complementary to her 2-1 basic attacks, not their own thing. There isn't really a single other god in the game that is this reliant on 2 abilities, let alone them both being steroids. Also, due to Freya's lack of any built-in attack speed to the kit like most ADCs, she is even more reliant on rings being good than the other magical ADCs are. All of this culminates in a design that can't be balanced simply by changing numbers. It's fundamentally broken and will be either god tier or trash tier depending on the meta and the state of her item pool. Which is why she's been reworked the joint most of any god in the game. But of course, those reworks didn't last long and she was eventually reverted back to her original kit that she released with and retains to this day. Her first rework, what I like to call Burst Freya, was, for what it's worth, the most fun version of the character in my opinion, though it's closely followed by Beta Freya when all basic attacks did physical damage and Freya could build crit with Deathbringer. That was also pretty funny. Burst Freya, originally reworked in July 2018, was familiar but played extremely differently due to her 2 now being a toggle between ranged and melee with no cooldown. In range, she restored 2% max health per hit and her basic attacks would pass through minions instead of doing splash damage with the 2 like they do now. And in melee, they were the same but they restored max mana on hit. The loop for Freya in this design was to spend a shit ton of mana using her 2 for insane lane clear and poke, and to try and restore that mana using the 6% max mana heal per basic attack in melee form and repeat. You basically tried to stay in range mode as often as physically possible and just went to melee to regain mana. This was helped by the fact that Book of Thoth was meta on Freya at the time. Yep, Freya was built basically full power and no attack speed with this design, a far cry from modern and I guess OG Freya, who relied heavily on attack speed. The reason for this was her reworked 1, Irradiate. Instead of being a duration based steroid like now, it boosted only her first basic attack after using it, but had insanely higher damage than it does now. It essentially front loaded all of that damage onto her first basic attack. This was probably the most broken Freya has ever been, aside from when Cerberus got into her pants, but that's a story for another day. This design, while the most fun by far in my opinion, was potentially only so fun because of how utterly broken it was. You could just build Book of Thoth, Polynomicon and full magical power, press 1 and the enemy died. It was that simple. If somehow they didn't die to that, you did the usual thing of ulting to secure the kill because you are building full power and it hit insanely hard. Fully utilizing that 140% power scaling that her ult has, which in her modern design isn't used as well because she needs to build some attack speed and not just full power. Needless to say, this rework didn't help Freya's balance issues one bit. In fact, it made them worse. since not only did she have the insane late game she's known for, but also crazy lane pressure, since her 2 was always active and went through minions, so she was basically magical Izanami but better in terms of early wave clear. Plus her 1 would proc on every minion hit and trigger the AoE damage due to her 2 going through the wave. Freya was absolutely busted and probably unbalanceable without just nerfing her into irrelevance with this design, therefore another rework was justified. After less than a year of this, in March 2019, Freya was reworked again. She kept the toggle nature of her 2 with percent mana restore as melee and percent health as ranged, but the mana cost was lowered substantially to allow her to get out more basic attacks overall. However, her 1 was made into 5 hits with less damage instead of 1 hit with all of it up front. The damage overall was much higher to compensate for needing to hit 5 basic attacks instead of just 1. While slightly less broken than Burst Freya, this design was still extremely strong on release and not that far from Freya's modern design really. She did keep the insane lane pressure and wave clear with this design through her 2 as it still pierced minions, and her 1 still applied the explosion damage to all 6 minions as it went through. She was still extremely broken on the release of this rework, and after trying to nerf her down to balance, Hi-Rez just straight up said fuck it, and reverted all changes made to Freya over the course of her last 2 reworks and just returned her to her original design she always had and still has to this day. It's slightly more balanceable than Burst Freya and 5 Autos Freya, but she still has all the same problems where she is far too reliant on items and far too polarizing in fights. Either she kills your whole team in 5 seconds or she becomes useless once her 2 and 1 wear off and she dies. I'd love to say we'll eventually get a design for Freya that allows her to be balanced, but after the pariah of her first 2 reworks, I don't know if Hi-Rez can take the pain of trying to fix this god design. So my guess is she will remain this way, being broken or trash for eternity. Peace out, you nerds.